I'm Adam Calaway at Cattle Chat Corner here at NCBA 2014 at Nashville, Tennessee. I've got Dr. Larry Berger. You're with the University of Nebraska. Will you tell us a little bit about what you do there?
Yes. I'm the head of the Department of Animal Science, and so we have about 400 undergraduates, about 60 graduate students, and my job is to help make sure that everything runs smoothly.
What are some of the big topics that your students are focused on right now that have happened in the last year that have really piqued their interest?
Students are very much interested in the future of animal agriculture. Obviously, they're thinking about jobs, about careers, what they're going to do 10 years from now. And so they really are asking the question, is there an opportunity for me in animal agriculture? And I think the opportunity is very great. It's positive. You have to be prepared. You have to bring something to the table that will help you be valuable to the future. But we're trying to train students to be in that situation.
As you look into the future, what do you see for animal agriculture?
I think it's extremely positive. Not only is the world population growing, so we're going to need to double food production in the next 30 to 40 years, but also we're going to need to do it with less resources. And so those students who have a good grasp of the science of agricultural production and can help their producing buddies do it at a more efficient, more sustainable manner, there's going to be a demand for those kind of students.
You said the word sustainable, so I have to ask. McDonald's has said that they're going to start purchasing verifiable sustainable beef by 2016. What does that mean? What is sustainability?
Well, as I was at a conference yesterday where McDonald's talked about that very thing, they're saying we don't have all the details defined for sustainable. But obviously they did talk about it has to be economically sustainable for the producer. It needs to be environmentally sustainable so that we have resources that are here for the next generation, so we're not using up all the resources in this generation. And it has to be socially acceptable. In other words, our consumers have to feel confident that the product we're producing is safe, wholesome, and something they can feel good about purchasing. So all those are factors that we have to consider when we think about what is sustainability.
Well, let's talk about some of those, because you talked about how the consumer feels about the product. One of the things that we've seen in the last year is a slew of commercials that portray agriculture as sort of a factory.
Yes.
And so let's go through that. What's your reaction when you see a commercial like that?
Well, it's really not representative, especially of what's occurring in the beef industry. Over 90% of the beef cattle operations in the U.S. are family farms. They're not factories. And yes, we do have some larger operations that may be, quote, incorporated from a business structure standpoint, but they're still family operations. And those families still consume the same beef that all the other consumers. And so they want to produce it in a safe, wholesome, satisfying manner because they're feeding that same beef to their family as what consumers are purchasing.
Well, one of the things that's part of that is that animal welfare component. Why are producers so concerned about animal welfare?
Well, one of the main concerns is that sometimes people look at animals and they assume that people and animals have the same perception of their environment, that they wouldn't want to live in this kind of condition, and so automatically animals wouldn't want to live in that condition. But that's not true in reality. Healthy animals that are well cared for, are the ones that are most profitable. And so producers actually are motivated to take good care of their animals because they know that healthy animals, ones that are properly cared for, are going to be the ones that make them the most money. And so when we think about animal welfare from a producer standpoint, it is really what's best for the animal.
What about the consumer? What do you think that they think is sustainable, and how is that playing into their decisions to purchase beef?
Well, I think often because of the media hype and some of the concerns, when they look at sustainability, they're really primarily concerned about environmental factors or factors that might affect water quality, might affect the amount of CO2 or methane that goes into the environment, that might affect the quality of the forage and pasture lands and that sort of thing. And all those are important to the producers as well. Producers who graze cattle, they want to have a long-term sustainable ranch, and if they abuse the land, if they take advantage of it, they know that it's not going to be as valuable in the future. And so really, we as producers have the same sort of concerns, but many of the consumers just don't have the experience, the background, the understanding of what it takes to raise animals, and so that's where the discrepancy and the problem often comes in.
One of the things that comes about when we start talking about sustainability is the economics behind it. Right now, we have the smallest cow herd that we've had since 1952, yet we're still producing the same amount of beef. How are we doing that?
Well, we're doing that because we've learned how to maximize the amount of product, the amount of lean beef that we produce from each animal. And that involves using technology. And so that involves raising animals in a way that for every calf that's born, we maximize the beef production. I was just in a meeting this morning where they talked about China's increased demand for beef and how that's going to drive consumption in the future. They don't have the cattle. We're going to supply that. So really, we need to try and figure out ways to optimize the production from each individual animal, and that's going to involve technology.
Well, let's talk about the technology then. What technology specifically are we looking at using that we're using now that are working, that we're going to use in the future? And then the big question is, people are scared of technology sometimes because it has changed. So let's discuss all that.
Yes. Well, when I talk about technology, I talk about a variety of things, all the way from using what we call growth promotants. Those are either hormones or feed additives that increase the efficiency of animal production. One of the things that many consumers don't realize that in Europe, for example, they don't castrate the males, and so they leave them intact. And the endocrine profile is higher in testosterone than it is in the U.S. So we replace that with hormones. It's no different than the hormones that would have been produced if it was the same intact male, but we don't have the behavior problems as we would get with mature bulls. There are other technologies, some of the feed additives that change the fermentation so we produce less methane and get more energy out of the same amount of feed. Those are two examples that have really increased the amount of beef we produce per animal and are actually beneficial for the environment.
Yet input costs are continuing to go up. In fact, we're seeing them go up significantly, whether it's fuel, sometimes now costs for water. How much more expensive is it to produce a calf today than it, say, 10 years ago?
Well, that's a number that's changing rapidly. You know, last year where we had very high feed costs, of course, it was up maybe double what it was 6-7 years ago. This year, because corn has come down a little bit, it's still higher, but it's not quite as high, maybe 70% higher than it was 10 years ago. All those increased costs are due very much to the amount of feed we have to raise. We're obviously have the same amount of land, and so we're trying to produce more beef from the same unit of land. So the value of the feeds that raise those animals increase. Also, when we're trying to make efficient use of grains for other purposes, that tends to increase the value of the grains, so that increases cost of production. The land values themselves have gone up because we're not making any more land. Cities are expanding. The amount of farmable land is decreasing. And so all those things actually influence how much a producer has to pay to produce a pound of beef.
Who absorbs the majority of that cost? And then some cost then passed on to the consumer?
Well, ultimately, the consumer is the one who pays all the bills. What I mean by that is if there's no money being spent at the grocery store that comes back to the packer and then to the feedlot and then to the cow-calf producer, eventually there would be no beef production because you couldn't sustain it economically. So ultimately, all the costs get passed on to the consumer in the long term. Now, in the short term, many times individual producers and ranchers have to absorb those costs because the value of their product doesn't increase. And so when we have real high grain prices, a lot of money was lost, especially in the cattle feeding industry, for 2 or 3 years until the beef production decreased, and that then raised the price to where it came into equilibrium. So it varies where you're at in the production cycle as who is absorbing the costs. In the short term, often it's the producers. In the long term, the consumer is the only one who pays the bills.
But in the end, despite the independent of the cost, we're still purchasing beef. In fact, we're purchasing more beef, right, than we ever have. Is that right?
Yes. So our beef consumption is still very high. Part of that is due to export, so it's not all being consumed in the U.S. But certainly consumers still enjoy beef. If you ask what is the most desirable meat choice, the majority of consumers will choose beef over pork and poultry. And so it's a very palatable, highly satisfying, very nutritious product, and people are willing to pay for a high quality product. And beef consumption is certainly reflecting their willingness to buy something that they really enjoy.
Well, if you could say one last thing to consumers, you were able to have a microphone and talk to all the consumers, what would you say about the beef industry?
The beef industry is interested and committed to producing a safe, wholesome, economically affordable product. We want consumers to enjoy beef. We want them to feel good about what they enjoy and that they have the permission to buy beef and consume it readily. So we're not in opposition. We understand consumer needs, we understand consumer interests, and we as an industry want to continue to supply a very high quality, wholesome product for their nutrition in the future.
Dr. Larry Berger, thank you for stopping by Cattle Chat Corner.